The splintered mahogany gavel felt warm and too small under Judge Alistair Finch's palm. He always noticed that one crack in the wood, a tiny bolt of lightning frozen just beneath the head, right at 2:15 in the afternoon. The courtroom in the old Jefferson County courthouse smelled, as it always did, of lemon polish, old paper, and the faint, damp wool of the public gallery behind him. He could hear the soft rustle of expensive silk back there, a sound that stood out against the hum of the air conditioner. He knew, without looking, that it was his wife, Eleanor. She came every Tuesday, a quiet show of support he'd always found comforting. Today, the sound felt like a weight against the back of his neck. "Plaintiff may call its next witness," Alistair said, his voice the same steady, calm instrument it had been for 22 years on the bench. He allowed his gaze, a practiced sweep of the room, to pass over the gallery. Eleanor sat in her usual seat in the second row, her cream-colored gloves folded neatly in her lap. She gave him the smallest of nods, her expression one of serene attention. It was a Wednesday, not a Tuesday. The thought popped into his head, uninvited. She'd changed her routine. He pushed the observation away, focusing on the case. It was a dry, tedious contract dispute between a local printing company, Inkwell and Sons, and a regional newspaper. The fate of several delivery trucks and a binding clause about paper quality hung in the balance. Theodore Lawson, the lawyer for the newspaper, was just finishing up his cross-examination. Alistair's eyes drifted to the young lawyer for the plaintiff, who was preparing to stand. He was a new face in Alistair's courtroom, maybe late 20s. His suit was a shade too new, a sharp navy blue. The young man stood. "Your Honor, the plaintiff calls Mr. Martin Shuley back to the stand." As he spoke, Alistair's world narrowed. He saw the way the young lawyer pushed a stray lock of dark hair from his forehead. He saw the distinct, stubborn cowlick at his left temple that refused to be tamed. It was a trivial detail, a quirk of hairstyle. But Alistair's heart gave a single, hard knock against his ribs. He knew that cowlick. He had seen it in black and white photographs, brushed his fingers against it in a sun-dappled apartment a lifetime ago. His mouth went dry. The clock above the heavy oak doors ticked, each second a grain of sand dropping. The routine of the courtroom continued, the shuffling of the witness, the court reporter's fingers poised over her machine, but for Alistair, the air had thickened. He gripped the gavel a little tighter, the splintered seam biting into his skin. It was then that the side door, the one used by the clerks, opened with a soft click. Mrs. Laney, the head clerk with her perpetual glasses on a chain, slipped in. Her face was unreadable as she walked with quick, quiet steps to the bailiff, Deputy Miller. She passed him a single, folded square of cream-colored paper. Alistair watched, his breath held, as Miller looked at the note, then at him. The bailiff's boots were quiet on the worn carpet as he approached the bench. A note. It could be anything. A scheduling conflict, a juror illness, a message from another judge. But notes delivered mid-testimony were rare. Miller placed it on the bench, just to the right of the case file. Alistair gave a curt nod, his eyes returning to the young lawyer, Leo, his name was Leo Mercer, who was consulting a legal pad. But Alistair's entire being was focused on that square of paper. He reached for it, his movements slow and deliberate to hide the slight tremor in his fingers. As he brought it closer, a scent reached him. Not the courtroom's lemon or dust, but a cheap, sweet perfume. Rosewater. The kind that came in a clear glass bottle with a plastic daisy on the cap. A scent that slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. It was the scent of the hallway outside apartment 4B in the old Magnolia Street complex. The scent that clung to the landlady, Mrs. Gable, who would knock on the door every first of the month. His vision blurred for a second. The courtroom, Leo Mercer, the sound of Eleanor shifting in her seat, it all faded into a dull roar. With numb fingers, he unfolded the note. There was no writing. No threat, no demand, no blackmail script. It was a child's drawing, rendered in the waxy, enthusiastic strokes of crayon. A stick figure family of 3 stood under a bright yellow sun with a smiling face. A lopsided house sat to the side. And the whole scene was pinned, in the corner of the paper, by the careful crayon outline of a refrigerator magnet. It was shaped like a lemon. A cheerful, yellow lemon. Alistair's blood turned to ice. He knew that magnet. It had held grocery lists and phone bills to the humming white refrigerator in apartment 4B. Theo had bought it at a flea market because he said it made the kitchen look happier. Alistair had laughed, running his thumb over its glossy, cold surface. No one else in the world knew about that magnet. No one but him and Theo. Theo, who had vanished from his life 23 years ago. A sharp, cracking sound ripped through the courtroom. Alistair flinched, his head jerking up. Everyone looked. Leo Mercer's pen had slipped from his hand. It hadn't just fallen, it had hit the edge of the wooden counsel table with a sound like a bone breaking, then clattered and spun on the hard floor before coming to a stop at the foot of the witness stand. For a heartbeat, there was perfect silence. Then Leo, his cheeks flushing pink, murmured an apology and bent to retrieve it. The young lawyer's eyes met Alistair's for a fraction of a second as he straightened up. They were a familiar shade of hazel green. Alistair felt the floor tilt. "Mr. Mercer," Alistair heard himself say, his voice miraculously steady. "Are you quite all right?" "Yes, Your Honor." "My apologies," Leo said, his voice clear, though a little tight. Alistair looked down at the drawing again. The lemon magnet. The 3 stick figures. The date written in a child's hand at the top corner, April 12. That was next week. He refolded the note with precise, mechanical movements, the paper whispering in the silent room. He placed it carefully under the corner of his legal pad, as if containing a live wire. "Let's take a 15-minute recess," Alistair announced, bringing the gavel down. The crack of wood on wood was definitive, a sound that usually brought order. Today, it felt like the first crack in a dam. He stood, his black robes swirling around him, and walked with measured steps through the door behind the bench that led to his chambers. The moment the door clicked shut, the calm mask shattered. He leaned back against the solid wood, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The scent of rosewater seemed to have followed him, clinging to his robes. His chambers were a sanctuary of order. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a wide, tidy desk of dark oak, a single framed photograph of him and Eleanor on their wedding day. He walked to the window, looking out over the courthouse square. The old maple trees were just beginning to show the faintest haze of green for April. Normal life. People walked dogs, bought coffee from the cart, laughed. He took the note from his pocket and unfolded it again on his desk. In the sunlight, the crayon wax gleamed. This wasn't just a memory. This was a message. A targeted, specific message meant for him and him alone. Someone knew about Theo. Someone knew about the apartment. Someone knew about the life he had buried so deep he sometimes convinced himself it had been a dream. And that someone had sent a young lawyer with a familiar cowlick into his courtroom. A soft knock came at the door. "Your Honor." It was Mrs. Laney. "Are you all right? You looked pale." "I'm fine, Mrs. Laney. Just a momentary spell. The air in there is quite close." He could hear the lie in his own voice, flat and unconvincing. "Of course," she said through the door, her tone suggesting she believed none of it. "Shall I hold any calls?" "Please," he said. When her footsteps receded, Alistair walked to the small, clean fireplace that had never held a fire. He took a book of matches from the mantel. His hands were shaking badly now. He struck a match, the sudden flare of sulfur and wood startling in the quiet room. He held the corner of the child's drawing to the flame. The crayon wax sizzled and melted before the paper caught, curling in on itself, the cheerful yellow sun blackening into nothing. He dropped the burning note into the cold fireplace, watching until it was nothing but fragile ash. The scent of smoke replaced the rosewater. He had destroyed the evidence, but not the truth. The truth was now a living thing, sitting in his courtroom in a navy blue suit. He had just committed his first irreversible act. He had burned the message. But by doing so, he had admitted its power. He was no longer a judge presiding over a case. He was a man who had just been served a subpoena from his own past, and he had no idea what it demanded of him. The only sound was the steady, accusing tick of the ship's clock on his bookshelf, marking the passage of a time that had just run out. The smell of smoke clung to Alistair Finch's fingers, a ghost of the note he'd just burned. Back in his judge's chambers, the quiet felt heavy and loud at the same time. He could still hear the echo of that pen hitting the floor, a sharp crack that seemed to have split his careful world right down the middle. The digital clock on his desk read 3:07 p.m. Recess was almost over. He had to go back out there. He splashed cold water on his face in the small private bathroom. The man in the mirror looked familiar, the silvering hair, the tired blue eyes, the fine lines of a life spent thinking carefully. But the eyes staring back at him now held a raw fear he hadn't seen in decades. He straightened his black robe, the fabric smooth under his trembling hands, and took a deep, shaky breath. Walking back into the courtroom felt like stepping onto a stage where he'd forgotten all his lines. The air was different. The dusty sunlight seemed to spotlight Leo Mercer, who was quietly reviewing his notes. Eleanor was still in the gallery, her posture perfect. She was looking not at him, but at the young lawyer, her head tilted just slightly, as if studying a difficult piece of music. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the room creaked and shuffled to its feet. Alistair took the bench. "Mr. Mercer, you may proceed." The rest of the afternoon was a blur of legal procedure that Alistair navigated on pure, automatic instinct. He ruled on objections, he guided the testimony, he maintained order. But his mind was 1,000 miles away, in a small, sun-filled apartment on Magnolia Street. He kept seeing that crayon drawing. The lemon magnet. He kept seeing Theo's smile, the one that always started in his eyes. Finally, at 4:45 p.m., he adjourned for the day. The gavel fell with a tired thud. People began to gather their things, the murmur of conversation filling the room. Alistair's eyes followed Leo Mercer as the young man carefully placed files into a worn leather briefcase. He moved with a focused efficiency, that same cowlick falling across his forehead. Alistair retreated to his chambers. He waited until the sounds in the hallway died down, the last closing door, the distant whir of the vacuum cleaner starting its evening rounds. The cleaning staff was here. The day was officially over. He had to know. He sat at his desk, the massive old oak piece that had once belonged to his father. His computer hummed softly. With fingers that felt thick and clumsy, he logged into the courthouse's internal record system. He wasn't supposed to do this. A judge shouldn't go digging into the personal details of an attorney appearing before him. But the pull was stronger than his sense of rules. He typed in the name, Leo Mercer, attorney at law. The profile loaded. Education, State University, law degree. Bar admission, just last year. Office address, a small shared suite on Pine Street. Nothing unusual. Then he clicked on the filed appearance form for today's case. It listed his full legal name for the court record. Leo Theodore Mercer. The name hit Alistair in the center of his chest. The air left his lungs in a soft rush. Theo had loved that name. He'd talked about it often in those dreamy, late-night conversations. "If I ever have a son," he'd said, staring at the ceiling fan in their apartment, "I'd name him Theodore. It means, gift of God." Alistair had laughed and said it was old-fashioned. But Theo had been stubborn. Leo Theodore Mercer. The young man's birthday was listed, too, March 15, 28 years ago. Alistair did the math quickly, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The timeline fit. It fit perfectly. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a strange trick of genetics. This was a son. His son. Theo's son. Their son. A living, breathing person with Theo's cowlick and, Alistair now realized, his own chin. The realization was a physical pain, a deep, aching hollow opening up inside him. He had a son. And for 28 years, he hadn't known. What had he missed? First steps, first words, school plays, scraped knees, birthdays. A lifetime of moments, lost. But why was he here now? In this courtroom, on this case? This dry contract dispute about printing invoices and delivery schedules. It made no sense. Unless. Alistair picked up his phone. His hand was steadier now, driven by a new, clear purpose. He called down to the records archive in the courthouse basement. An older woman named Gloria answered. She'd worked there for 40 years and knew everything about every box of files. "Gloria, it's Alistair Finch. I need a small favor. Can you look up the master file for case number 2024-1147, Inkwell and Sons vs. County Herald? I need to know who the original filing attorney was." He could hear her typing, the keys clacking slowly. "Just a moment, Judge. Okay, here it is. That one's odd. It was originally filed by a firm over in Carlton, Branson and Cole. But they withdrew representation 2 weeks ago. The new attorney of record is Leo Mercer. Filed the substitution paperwork himself. Was a reason given for the withdrawal? Alistair asked, his mouth dry. Just says, professional differences, Gloria said. But between you and me, Judge, Branson and Cole are a big firm. They don't usually handle small contract stuff. And they sure don't pass cases off to rookies in shared offices on Pine Street. It's like they planted the case and then handed him the keys. Thank you, Gloria. You've been a tremendous help. He hung up, the pieces clicking together with a terrible, cold clarity. This wasn't Leo's case. He'd been handed it. Placed into it. The drawing, the perfume, the sudden substitution of attorneys, it was a trail of breadcrumbs, leading Leo right to this courtroom. Right to him. Someone was using his son as a message. But who? And what was the message? Was it a threat? Blackmail? Or was it something else? He thought of Eleanor, sitting so calmly in the gallery, watching Leo. Did she know? The idea was a fresh wave of ice water. Their marriage had been a comfortable, quiet partnership for 25 years. Built on respect, shared interests, and a mutual, unspoken agreement not to dwell on the past. Had she always known about Theo? Had she known about this? His mind raced back to Theo's goodbye. It had been a rainy afternoon in September. Theo had been distant for weeks, talking about needing a fresh start, about opportunities on the West Coast. Alistair had been heartbroken but young, scared of what their love meant in their small town. He'd let him go. The last letter, 6 months later, had a California return address and was full of cheerful, empty details about sunshine and new friends. Then, silence. Alistair had assumed Theo had found the happy, open life he'd wanted. He'd buried his own heartache, met Eleanor, built a new life on top of the old one. Now, he wondered if every word of that last letter had been a lie. The vacuum cleaner's hum in the hallway stopped. A deep silence settled over the courthouse. He was alone with the truth. He stood and walked to the bookshelf, pulling down a heavy, leather-bound volume. It wasn't a law book. It was a photo album he never looked at. Hidden between its pages was a single, faded photograph. He and Theo, arms around each other's shoulders, squinting into the sun on a fishing pier. They were so young, their faces open and full of hope. Theo's hair had that same cowlick. Alistair traced the edge of the photograph. He had made a choice back then, a choice to hide, to be safe, to conform. He had thought he was protecting them both. But he had just been protecting himself. And in doing so, he had lost everything. Now, the past had walked back into his life, wearing a navy blue suit and carrying a worn briefcase. It wasn't here to punish him. It was here to be seen. Leo Mercer, his son, was the living, breathing question his father had been too afraid to ask for 28 years. The question hung in the silent, darkening room: what do you do when the secret you buried isn't a ghost anymore, but a person asking for nothing more than to be acknowledged? Alistair knew the next move was his. He could continue to hide, to use his power to bury this case and hope Leo went away. Or he could do the one thing he'd been too scared to do a lifetime ago. He could look at the truth, right in its hazel green eyes, and finally, after all this time, tell the truth. He placed the photograph carefully back in the book. He didn't have the answer yet. But for the first time, he was asking himself the right question. And sometimes, that's where every good and brave thing begins. The grandfather clock in the hallway of Alistair's home chimed 3 times. Each deep, resonant bong felt like a hammer strike in the silent, dark house. He sat alone in his study, the only light coming from a single green glass lamp on his desk. It was 3 a.m. Sleep was impossible. Before him, laid out with a kind of terrible neatness, were 2 objects. On the left was a formal, silver-framed photograph of him and Eleanor on their wedding day, 25 years ago. They looked happy, proper, their smiles matching and measured. On the right was the faded snapshot from the fishing pier, him and Theo, young and grinning, their hair messed by the wind. He looked from one photo to the other, and for the first time, he truly saw the man in the middle. Not the respected Judge Finch. Not the young man in love. But the man who had chosen the frame over the pier. The man who had taken the safe, quiet path and called it honor. His study was a perfect room. Leather-bound books stood straight on polished shelves. A globe sat in the corner. The Persian rug was vacuumed into perfect lines. It was the room of a man who believed he could control everything, even his own story. But the story had escaped. It was living a few miles away in a small apartment, probably asleep, unaware of the earthquake it had caused. Alistair's eyes drifted to the window. The old maple tree in the yard was just beginning to show the barest hint of spring buds in the moonlight. A season was changing outside, and a season was ending inside him. He thought of Leo's face in the courtroom, the focused intensity, the slight nervousness as he dropped his pen. He hadn't seen anger there. He'd seen determination. But determination for what? A soft knock on the study door made him jump. Eleanor stood in the doorway, wrapped in her blue robe. Her gray hair was loose around her shoulders, and without her usual careful style, she looked older, and somehow more real. "You haven't come to bed," she said. Her voice wasn't accusing. It was quiet, tired. "I couldn't sleep," he replied. She stepped into the room, her eyes taking in the 2 photographs on the desk. She didn't look surprised. She walked over and gently picked up the wedding photo. She ran her thumb over the glass. "I always liked this picture," she said softly. "We looked so hopeful." "Eleanor," Alistair began, 1,000 apologies, 1,000 explanations crowding his throat. She held up a hand, stopping him. She put the wedding photo down and, with a calm that took his breath away, she picked up the picture of him and Theo. She studied it for a long moment, a sad, knowing smile touching her lips. "He had a kind face," she said finally. The world stopped turning. The air vanished from the room. She knew. She had always known. "How long?" Alistair whispered, the words scraping out. "Always," she said, placing the photo back down with immense care. "My father had the file on you. When you started courting me. He was thorough. He told me before he gave his blessing. He said you had entanglements in your past, but that you were a man who valued discretion above all else." She looked at him, her eyes clear in the lamplight. "I thought, in time, you would tell me. I waited. A year. 5. 10. You never did. So I decided the silence was the gift you could give me. Your past was yours. Our life was ours." Alistair felt stripped bare. Every quiet dinner, every shared holiday, every moment of their life together had been built on this foundation she had knowingly helped him maintain. She hadn't been fooled. She had been compassionate. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" he asked, his voice choked. "Because you were so very careful, Alistair," she said, and for the first time, he heard a ripple of old pain in hers. "You built this beautiful, quiet life with such precision. I didn't want to be the one to crack the glass. And I suppose I was afraid of what you might say. I was afraid the truth was that you still loved him, and that what we had was just the shadow." He stood up, his chair scraping back. "No. Eleanor, what we have is real. It is." But even as he said it, he knew it was only half the truth. What they had was real, but it had been built by hiding a part of his heart in a locked box and throwing away the key. She nodded, accepting his words as she had accepted so much. "This young lawyer. Leo. He's Theo's, isn't he?" Alistair could only nod. "He looks like you," she said. "Around the jaw. And he has your focus." She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. "What are you going to do?" That was the impossible choice. It lay before him now, clear and terrible. Option 1, he could do nothing. He could finish this contract case, let Leo Mercer disappear back into the world. He could use his influence to ensure no one ever connected the dots. He could protect his career, his reputation, the quiet life he and Eleanor had built. He could let the past stay buried. But to do that, he would have to look his own son in the eye every day in that courtroom and deny him. He would be repeating the same cowardly choice he'd made 28 years ago. He would be telling Leo, and Theo's memory, that they were not worth the risk. Option 2, he could speak. He could acknowledge Leo. It would be a scandal. The news would explode, respected judge's secret past. His career on the bench would likely be over. The quiet life with Eleanor would be shattered by headlines and whispers. He would have to face a son who might hate him for his absence. He would have to explain a lifetime of silence. Eleanor watched him wrestling with it. "You can't hide him, Alistair," she said gently. "He's not a photograph you can put in a book. He's a person. And he came here for a reason." "But why?" Alistair burst out, the frustration and fear pouring out. "Is it money? Revenge? Does he hate me?" "Maybe," Eleanor said. Or maybe he's just a young man who wants to know where he comes from. Maybe he needs his father. The word father hung in the air between them. It was a word Alistair had never associated with himself in any real, emotional way. It was a title he had never earned. He sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. The weight of it all was crushing him. The fear of loss, the shame of the past, the terrifying possibility of a future he couldn't control. "I don't know how to do this," he confessed, his voice muffled. Eleanor came around the desk and placed a cool hand on his shoulder. It was a simple touch, but it grounded him. "You start by telling the truth. To yourself first. Then to him." She left him then, moving silently back into the darkness of the hallway. He was alone again with the ticking clock and the two photographs. He thought of Theo. Not the ghost of his memories, but the real man. Theo, who loved bad puns and grew tomatoes in pots on the fire escape. Theo, who was terrified of thunderstorms and who wanted to name a son Theodore. What had his life been like after he left? The cheerful letters from California, they had felt thin, even then. Why had he really gone? A desperate need to know seized Alistair. He turned to his computer, the blue light harsh in the dark room. He began to search, not for Leo, but for Theo. He typed in the full name he hadn't spoken aloud in decades, Theodore James Vance. Social media yielded nothing. Old phone directories were digital dead ends. Then, almost as an afterthought, he searched the name in the digital archives of the County Herald, the very newspaper involved in the case in his courtroom. One result appeared. It wasn't a news story. It was a tiny, paid death notice from 8 years ago, buried in the classifieds of the August 12th edition. Asterisk Vance, Theodore James. Age 45. Passed peacefully at home on August 8th. A private soul, loved by his friends. No services. Donations may be made to the city shelter, asterisk. The words were simple. They were devastating. Theo hadn't been in California. He had died right here, in their hometown, at the age of 45. The home mentioned was probably a small apartment. The friends were strangers to Alistair. And the notice was placed by someone listed only as J.M. Alistair read the date again. 8 years ago. He had been a judge for 14 years by then. He had been sitting in his comfortable study, in this quiet house, while the love of his young life died a few miles away. Theo had been here, sick, alone, and he had never reached out. Why? The answer came to him with a piercing, shameful clarity. Theo hadn't reached out because Alistair had made it perfectly clear, all those years ago, that he wanted a different life. A safe life. Theo had respected that boundary, even in his dying days. He had carried the truth, and their son, all by himself. The screen blurred in front of Alistair's eyes. A deep, silent sob shook his shoulders. He had failed. He had failed Theo in every way that mattered. And then, like the final piece of a heartbreaking puzzle, he understood. The note with the drawing. The lemon magnet. It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. A plea. It was the only way Leo knew how to reach him. He had taken this insignificant case, maybe even been given it by some mysterious J.M., just to get into Alistair's courtroom. To be seen. To see the man who was his father. Leo didn't want money or revenge. He wanted an answer to the question he'd carried his whole life: who am I? The grandfather clock chimed the half-hour, a single, mournful note. And then Alistair realized the story Theo had told him, about moving away for a fresh start and a happy life, was a lie. It was a beautiful, painful lie Theo had told to set him free. To let him live the life he thought he wanted, without guilt, without looking back. The truth was so much simpler, and so much sadder. Theo had stayed. He had raised their son. And he had died, asking for nothing, but hoping, perhaps, that one day his son would find the courage to ask for everything. Sunlight, thick with swirling dust motes, cut across the Jefferson County courtroom. It was 9:02 a.m., and the air felt charged, like the moment before a summer storm. Alistair Finch adjusted his black robe as he took the bench, the familiar fabric now feeling like a costume. His eyes found Leo Mercer immediately. The young lawyer was arranging his notes, that same stubborn cowlick falling across his forehead. Today, Alistair didn't look away. "Counselor, you may proceed with your redirect examination," Alistair said, his voice calm and clear in the hushed room. Leo stood. "Thank you, Your Honor." The case plodded forward, a tedious dance about breached contracts and material warranties. But today, Alistair was no longer a passive observer. He was a guide. A very precise, deliberate guide. For 22 years, he had used his deep knowledge of courtroom procedure to maintain order, to control the flow of information, to keep everything neat and contained. Today, he would use that same skill for the opposite purpose. He would use order to force the truth into the open. When the lawyer for the defense, a man named Mr. Briggs with a loud, blustery voice, objected, Alistair was ready. "Objection, relevance." Briggs boomed. "This line of questioning about the paper supplier's financials is a fishing expedition." Alistair steepled his fingers. "Mr. Briggs, the plaintiff's claim hinges on the quality and source of materials. The financial stability of the supplier is directly relevant to their ability to provide consistent quality." Objection overruled. "Mr. Mercer, continue." Leo blinked, surprised. He shot a quick glance at the judge, then back at his notes. "Thank you, Your Honor." A few minutes later, it happened again. Briggs tried to block the introduction of a series of internal emails. "Hearsay. This is classic hearsay, Judge." Alistair leaned forward. "These are business records of a party opponent, made in the regular course of business. They fall firmly under the exception." Objection overruled. "The emails will be entered into evidence as Exhibit D." He could feel the shift in the room. The court reporter paused, her fingers hovering over her machine. The bailiff shifted his weight. They all knew Judge Finch was fair, but he was never this, helpful. He was systematically removing every obstacle in Leo's path. From the corner of his eye, Alistair saw Eleanor in the gallery. She was watching him, her expression unreadable. He gave her the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. She closed her eyes for a second, then opened them and nodded back. It was all the permission he needed. The morning sun climbed higher, its beam now illuminating the old, forgotten lens of the court reporter's recording device, making it look like a watchful, golden eye. Leo, growing more confident with each ruling, began to find his rhythm. "Your Honor," he said, his voice stronger now, "at this time, I would like to call a rebuttal witness. I call Ms. Jeanette Miller to the stand." A murmur rippled through the few spectators. This wasn't on the official witness list. Briggs shot to his feet, red-faced. "Your Honor. This is a blatant ambush. We have no prior disclosure." Alistair looked at Leo. "Mr. Mercer, can you justify this late addition?" Leo stood very straight. "Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Miller's testimony became necessary only after the defense's cross-examination yesterday, which opened the door to questions of intent and prior knowledge. She is the office manager for the Branson and Cole firm, which originally filed this suit." Alistair felt a cold thrill of understanding. This was it. Leo wasn't just following the case anymore, he was steering it toward something bigger. Toward the people who had placed him here. The court will allow it, Alistair said evenly. Given the circumstances, Mr. Briggs, you may have a 10-minute recess to confer with your client. Briggs spluttered but sat down, furious. During the recess, Alistair stayed on the bench, pretending to review a document. He watched Leo. The young man stood by the window, his profile etched against the light. He looked so much like Theo in that moment, the same set of the shoulders, the same quiet intensity. But there was a vulnerability there, too. This wasn't easy for him. When the court was called back to order, a sharp-faced woman in her 60s took the stand. She was sworn in. Leo approached the podium, his notes abandoned. He was speaking from memory now. Ms. Miller, you manage the intake files at Branson & Cole, is that correct? It is, she said, her voice clipped. And can you tell the court who brought the Inkwell and Sons case to your firm initially? She shifted in her seat. A client referred it. And the name of that client? Leo asked, his tone gentle but insistent. I'm not at liberty to say. Client-attorney privilege. Leo didn't miss a beat. He turned and walked to his table. He picked up a single sheet of paper. Your Honor, I have here a copy of a filing fee check, submitted with the original complaint. It is a personal check, not a firm check. I would like to enter it into evidence. Briggs was on his feet again, but Alistair could see the man's confidence was cracking. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The check is a business record of the court's own clerk, Mr. Briggs, Alistair said, his voice leaving no room for argument. It will be entered. Proceed, Mr. Mercer. Leo handed the check to the bailiff, who showed it to Ms. Miller. Her face went pale. Ms. Miller, the check is made out to the Jefferson County Court, and it is signed by you. But in the memo line, it says, Client, J.M., for L.M. Can you tell us who J.M. is? The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. She looked from Leo, to the check, to the back of the gallery. Alistair followed her gaze. A man in a neat, brown suit sat alone in the last row. He was older, with kind, tired eyes. He gave Ms. Miller a single, slow nod. She let out a breath. J.M. is Joseph Miller. My brother. He asked me to file the case. He paid the fee. And why did Joseph Miller want this case filed? Leo asked, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. The entire courtroom leaned in to hear. He wanted to create a reason. A reason for a young lawyer to be in this courtroom. He said it was a gift. A long overdue gift. Leo stood perfectly still for a moment. Alistair could see his knuckles were white where he gripped the podium. He turned and looked directly at the man in the brown suit, Joseph Miller. Then, slowly, he turned to face the bench. His hazel-green eyes met Alistair's, and in them was not anger, but a profound, heartbreaking question. Your Honor, Leo said, his voice clear and strong in the silent room. I have no further questions for this witness. He walked back to his seat, his shoulders squared, but his head bowed slightly, as if a great weight had just shifted. Alistair understood everything now. Joseph Miller, J.M., the name on Theo's death notice. Theo's friend. The one who had been with him at the end. He had orchestrated all of this. Not to harm, but to heal. He had created this entire legal charade to bring a son face to face with his father. It was the most complicated, beautiful, and terrifying gift Alistair had ever heard of. The truth was now out in the open, lying on the evidence table in the form of a personal check. It was undeniable. Alistair looked at Leo, who was staring at his own hands. He looked at Eleanor, who had a handkerchief pressed to her lips. He looked at Joseph Miller, who simply watched him, waiting. The gavel was in his hand. He could call for a recess. He could hide behind procedure for a little while longer. But he had been hiding for a lifetime. He took a deep breath, the sound loud in the microphone before him. He placed the gavel down gently on its sound block. He stood up. Every eye in the courtroom was on him. The clock ticked over to 11:17 a.m. "The court," Alistair Finch said, his voice ringing with a new kind of authority, "will take a brief recess. Counselors, please join me in my chambers." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked toward the door behind the bench, leaving the stunned silence in his wake. He was finally walking toward the truth, and he was no longer afraid of what he would find there. The chipped blue door of the apartment on Magnolia Street was slightly ajar, letting out a warm rectangle of yellow light onto the dim hallway floor. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late April, exactly 1 month since the recess had been called in courtroom 3B. The air smelled of fresh paint from another unit down the hall, and of roasting coffee from inside. Alistair Finch stood before the door, but he wasn't wearing his black robes. He wore a simple, comfortable sweater the color of oatmeal and a pair of old khakis. In his hands, he held a medium-sized cardboard box, its corners softened with age. He could hear gentle movements inside, the clink of a mug, the soft thud of a cabinet closing. He knocked lightly on the open door. "It's open," a voice called from inside. Leo's voice. Alistair pushed the door open the rest of the way. The apartment was small, bright, and filled with the chaos of a recent move. Packing boxes were stacked against one wall, some sealed with tape, others overflowing with books. The furniture was a mismatched, comfortable collection of second-hand pieces. And there, on the humming white refrigerator, held in place by a cheerful yellow lemon magnet, was a grocery list. Milk, eggs, bread, coffee. Leo turned from the kitchen counter, a coffee pot in his hand. He was wearing jeans and a faded university t-shirt. He looked younger like this, more like the 28-year-old man he was, and less like the attorney in a stiff suit. That familiar cowlick was, of course, present. For a long second, they just looked at each other. The courtroom, the judges, the lawyers, all of it had fallen away. It was just two men in a quiet apartment, with a lifetime of unsaid words hanging between them. "You found the place," Leo said finally, a small, nervous smile touching his lips. "Gloria in the records office gave me the address," Alistair said, his own voice feeling rough. "I hope it's all right that I came." Yeah, of course. I was just making coffee." Leo gestured with the pot. "Would you?" "I would love some," Alistair said, and he meant it. He stepped fully inside, letting the blue door swing shut behind him with a soft click. He placed the cardboard box carefully on the small, scarred wooden dining table. Leo busied himself with 2 mugs, his movements careful. Alistair could see a fresh, pink scar on Leo's thumb, probably from a box cutter or a piece of tape during the move. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was full. Full of all the looking they were finally allowed to do. Alistair saw Theo's expressive eyes, and the shape of his own mother's chin. Leo saw the silvering hair and the lined face of the man whose photograph his father had kept in a book. "How's the case?" Leo asked, bringing the mugs to the table. The rich, bitter smell of coffee filled the space between them. "Settled," Alistair said, accepting the mug. "Yesterday. Inkwell and the Herald reached an agreement." "It was never really about the trucks, was it?" Leo shook his head, looking into his own coffee. "No. It wasn't." He took a breath. Joseph Miller, he was my dad's best friend. Really, his only family at the end. He's the one who told me about you. After Dad died, I was just a teenager. Joe helped me with everything. He said he'd help me find you when I was ready. It took me a long time to be ready. Alistair nodded, the weight of that responsibility settling on him gently. I met with Joe last week. He's a good man. He loved your father very much. He did, Leo said, his voice thick. He looked at the box on the table. What's this? It's for you, Alistair said, pushing it slightly forward. It's not much. It's him. Things he would have wanted you to have. Things I should have given you a long time ago. Leo's hands were careful as he opened the flaps. The first thing he pulled out was the photograph from the fishing pier. He stared at it, his finger tracing the edge where two young men had their arms slung around each other, squinting into a sun that still seemed to shine from the paper. He was so happy here, Leo whispered. We both were, Alistair said. Next came a small, cloth-bound journal. Leo opened it to a random page. It was filled not with writing, but with small, beautiful sketches, of the lemon tree outside their apartment window, of a pair of hands holding a coffee mug, of a sleeping cat. He was an artist, Leo said, a wonder in his voice. He always said he was just a waiter who liked to doodle. He was an artist, Alistair confirmed softly. There were other things. A tie-pin shaped like a tiny bird. A well-read book of poetry with passages underlined. A recipe for tomato soup, written in Theo's looping handwriting on a grease-spotted card. Each object was a piece of a man Leo had only known as his quiet, sometimes sad, but always loving father. Now he was seeing the young, vibrant man Theo had been. Leo held the recipe card, his eyes glistening. He made this soup every time I was sick. He said it was a magic recipe. It came from a cafe down the street from our apartment, Alistair said, a memory surfacing so clearly it was like watching a movie. We ate there every Sunday. He bribed the cook for the recipe with a drawing of her dog. A laugh, sudden and bright, escaped Leo. It was a sound that seemed to break the last of the ice in the room. Alistair found himself smiling, a real, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. They sat and drank their coffee. They didn't talk about the past, or the what-ifs, or the lost years. Not yet. That would come in time. Instead, Leo told him about starting his law practice, about his love for constitutional history. Alistair talked about the perennials he was trying to grow in his garden, and how the courthouse pigeons were an ongoing nuisance. It was ordinary, simple talk. The kind of talk fathers and sons might have on a lazy afternoon. The weight was still there, the weight of a story that began with a secret and a lot of pain, but it was a weight they were now sharing. It was no longer a burden for one person to carry alone. Outside the window, the spring afternoon was fading into a soft, golden evening. A breeze ruffled the new leaves on the tree just outside, and they made a sound like gentle applause. Leo got up to refill their mugs. At the counter, he paused, looking at the sugar bowl. Sugar? He asked, glancing back. Alistair, who had always taken his coffee black, found himself nodding. Yes. 1 spoon, please. It was a small thing. A tiny choice to accept something sweet. When Leo sat back down, his expression was thoughtful. Eleanor came to see me last week. Alistair's heart swelled. He knew they had met, but he hadn't asked for details. She told me she was going. She's really kind, Leo said, as if surprised by the fact. She brought me a plant. A peace lily. She said it's hard to kill. He smiled again. She told me she's glad I'm here. She said you were a good man who got very good at being careful, and that maybe I could help you remember how to be a little less careful. She's always been wiser than me, Alistair said, his throat tight. They sat in the comfortable quiet again, the history in the box on the table between them no longer a wall, but a bridge. The scar on Leo's thumb shone in the warm light of the kitchen lamp. Alistair's own hands, once so steady on a gavel, now rested loosely around his coffee mug, at peace. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning a new chapter, one written not in whispers or secrets, but in quiet conversations, in shared memories, and in the simple, brave act of showing up. Sometimes the greatest courage isn't in facing a courtroom, but in knocking on a blue door. And the most powerful healing doesn't always come from forgetting the past, but from finally, gently, allowing it a place at the table.